Good evening to everybody. Um, I'm not an art historian, so I'll get that out of the way immediately. I might as well be looking into a big ditch, just looking at some of Nano Reid's paintings. That's been quite honest. Some of Nano Reid's paintings I don't understand from one end of the painting to the other. So I'm not an art historian. Uh, and the talk tonight on the slideshow um, is about Nano just as a woman. Who was she? So it's like a CSI that I do on people. If someone tells me about somebody or about an event, just go back to the beginning and lift Nano up to the table and say, we'll do a CSI on you, taken from the telly series, The Crime Scene Investigate. So let's have a look at Nano and see what you can find out about her. When she was born, what she did, when she came back to Drogheda, just as a woman rather than more or less an artist, which I know very little about. And so this is what tonight's talk is all about. So I'll be flicking through the slides maybe pretty quickly. There's a good few in it, and maybe then there can be questions at the end, and hopefully there'll be time for that. So begin this evening with this image, which is just close to us, just out here, 70 metres to the corner of Clark's Pub, where it is said that Nano was born and had lived for many years. There is a plaque to Nano. It's the only one in Drogheda. There's a lot of commemorations to the male variation in Drogheda, but there's very little to women in Drogheda of any kind of memorials. Maybe one to Mother Mary Martin, but there's very few apart from that. And maybe Nano could do with a better plaque. All due respects to this one that's here. When you zoom in on this one a little bit closer, on Clark's Pub over here, Nano Reid was described as Ireland's foremost visual artist. She was one of 4 children who lived here from birth until 1926, and Nano felt unappreciated by her own hometown. There's 2 little things in that I see in maybe just not quite correct. At the beginning, she wasn't born. She didn't live in it until 1926 anyway. I'll show you in a minute when she did move. And the other part is Nano felt unappreciated by her hometown. And what I seen in looking at Nano and who she'd spoken to, interviews she'd given, people who had followed her throughout her life as well, that she could be a little bit of a fibber, just a little bit, because she had said at one time as well that a lecture that she had come back early to give in Drogheda, which turned out to be 1936, and she had said in an interview after with Marion Fitzgerald from the Western People, and then went on later in her life to tell the likes of Jerry Cullen, the brilliant local singer who had frequented Molly Reid's pub, her sister, and Nano would come down to have a chat with them sometimes, and Jerry would often give Nano a lift out to the coast. And Jerry would say he'd give her a lift out to the coast, maybe to Dunaney Point in County Louth, and she'd just stand looking out to the sea for ages, he'd say. For ages, literally saying nothing and looking nowhere, only out to the sea. And then she would come back to the car and just say, right, that was it, she was going home. And on the way out and the way back, she would say very little. She'd just stand looking out to the sea. But Jerry also told me that she had told him about the time she'd come back to Drogheda and done the lecture, and sure, only a handful turned up. But there was a lot more than a handful turning up, and as we go through it, I have a lot of stuff from the local regional newspapers, of which there was 2 in the town at the time, the Drogheda Argus and the Drogheda Independent. And along with the Dundalk Democrat or Argus and the Meath Chronicle, they were following Nano from the beginning. So people were certainly aware of Nano Reid, there's no question about that. Whether they understood her or not is a different thing. And maybe that's what she meant about being unappreciated, because, as I said, some of her paintings that you look at, I can't make head nor tail of them. These abstract art that she does, and that's with all due respect to her. So the next one then is this transfer of license from Mrs. Roach to Thomas Reid, which you can see the transfer of the license is June the 16th, 1900. Up to this point, Nano Reid's mother and father had been running a pub in Little Denmark Street in Dublin, number 30 in Little Denmark Street, where they both ran a pub. And they didn't come down until May and move into the premises here in Clark's until June. So then we go, the next one is Nano's birth certificate, and it shows that for a start, it says it here on the left column, Magdalen Street, not Fair Street or Peter Street, which Clark's pub is, number 19 Peter Street, number 1 Fair Street, because it's on the corner. So Nano Reid was definitely not born in Clark's pub or in this premises that we're after seeing. Registered on April the 3rd, but she was born on March the 1st, 1900. And again, she would say in interviews, she never told anyone what age she was. Sometimes she put people in two, even in interviews, and I've seen it. Irish Times, Irish Independent, Western People, County Waterford newspapers, and she cut the boots of someone over her age. She refused to tell their age. What business was it got to do with them? And she quoted many times that I see, and it's like what Maud Gonne said, old age is hell. And that's the way she used to answer some people. And in some instances, she did say she was born around 1905. Some other references has got her 1910. But she was definitely born March the 1st, 1900. And she was the second eldest of the family. Her sister, Mary Bridget, who became Molly Reid, who owned the pub. Molly Reid was born in August of 1898. And Molly born first, August 1898, and then on March the 1st, 1900, Nano was born. And they were both of those two eldest in the family, the sisters, were born in a different place than Clark's. They were born here. So really about 80 metres just up the road. So instead of turning left into Fair Street where Clark's pub is, you continue on up Magdalen Street for less than 100 metres, and you have another public house which is still there today, which is this Nugent's Bar, and it's upstairs here, in these upstairs rooms that Nano was certainly born, number 17, 18 and 19, and that 17 is the corner pub, 18 and 19 is the extensions to it, and it's certainly here where Nano Reid was born. Her father also owned the pub, so where I have the green arrow there, that's actually pointing down now at Clark's pub here in the corner as you turn into Fair Street, so that you can just about see Clark's pub. That's the distance between the two pubs. The red arrow that's pointing down at the window next to Sullivan's Auctioneers, that was a pub called Mary Clare's. So many of you might remember a pub here in Drogheda called Mary Clare's. By the time it closed, it was called Brannigan's Public House and Restaurant. And Nano's mother's people, the Downies, came from less than 1.5 miles to the northwest of Drogheda here. So as you're on the way back up to Dundalk on the old North Road, of course there's a roundabout now which takes you over to the motorway or over to the M1 retail park. Just before you come to that roundabout on the North Road leaving Drogheda, on your left hand side today would be the old cement quarry with a gigantic hole down the middle of it. Well, it was in there where John Downey, Nano's grandfather, had a farm and where he worked. And they had a lot of land in there. It was called Mell House. There was an entrance in from the North Road to Mell House, and there was an entrance out the back of it which brought you out to the area of Mell, or the Slane Road in Drogheda. So it was a pretty substantial farm. And it was there that John Downey, her grandfather, resided, and where Nano Reid spent a lot of time. Now, in Magdalen Street as well, up at the very top of Magdalen Street, there was another little premises, a grocer's shop on the corner as you go round the top of Magdalen Street, and John Downey also owned that premises. So John Downey owned a lot of premises in Drogheda, and here he had Nugent's pub, which is today, and the pub that later became Mary Clare's. And that's the pub that Nano's aunt ran. Her name was Agnes Downey, and Agnes Downey, who ran the pub where the red arrow is now today, Agnes Downey in 1902, her aunt, married a man called James Casey, who lived the other side of the block of those buildings in Bolton Street, near where the Saturday morning market is. And Casey's lived at number 6 Bolton Street, Drogheda. And Agnes Downey, Nano's aunt, married James Casey from number 6 Bolton Street, also a public house, and she married him in 1902, and the two of them up sticks from Drogheda and move out to Garmentstown in County Meath, where they buy the public house, the Garmentstown Arms, which is across the road from the old Cock Tavern pub on that old main road. and they lived there until 1905. And on Stephen's Day 1905, James Casey went out to shoot rabbits on Stephen's Day and blew the head off himself in Balscadden in County Dublin when he was crossing the ditch, accidentally shot himself. And that was the end of James Casey. And in 1911, you find Agnes Downey is back running Nugent's pub, and they're also running the pub that became Mary Clare's. And she writes on the census in 1911, her aunt, leaving here at the end of the month. And she just adds that into the census for no other reason. She didn't have to, but she says vacating or leaving this premises at the end of the month. So they owned a number of pubs and married into publicans as well. So at least they had 3 pubs here, 2 shops and a grocer's and a pub in Magdalen Street. Her mother and father ran a pub in Little Denmark Street in Dublin, and then her aunt married James Casey from Bolton Street, and they ran a pub in Garmentson. So it's like a tanner marrying a tanner. The publicans married into each other. Her father's premises was about 3 or 4 kilometres, about 2.5 miles to the northeast of here, out at Ballymakenny, Carntown. And that was a big house, Carntown, belonging to the Reid family, farmland, and the old ruins of a 17th century tower house as well, that was in ruins when Nano would have played out there as a child. And there is some peculiar mouth pullers like gargoyles and those kind of medieval features out there. Also, the Downey household out at Killinear, it was often referred to, or Mel, on the North Road, and the Reid household out on the Ballymakenny Road at Carntown. When you look at 1937 folklore papers on the school's manuscripts, both places refer to the Reids. A lot of the children refer to a Miss Reid who had the cure for everything. Miss Reid is the woman to go to. Also, the place is full of fairies and lone thorn bushes and stray sods and banshees, and the same fairies are playing football out here at the Downey. So folklore on both farms where Nano came from. And she was definitely spending time as a young kid out in both her maternal and paternal grandparents' house. This is another clip from the Drogheda Independent, September the 6th, 1890. This is again her grandfather, John Downey. John Downey also became mayor of Drogheda from 1901 to 1902. And he's sitting in the mayor's chair when the first cars come into Drogheda. And they are definitely the first cars coming into Drogheda, and there's ructions about them because they're causing mayhem on the streets. They're causing horses and ponies to run all over the place, jump on cars. Dust is flying up on a Sunday as they're doing tours through the town. And it's Downey is the man who's totally against them and what they're doing to the poor horse. And he's a wealthy premises all over the town. And here's a place where this is the last clay smoking pipe factory in Drogheda. And many of you would know, and anyone who's worked at archaeology and the Drogheda Museum and in Dundalk, you find the clay pipe bowls with the names on them. Many of them has the Connor name on them. And here John Downey has purchased the clay pipe factory, but he's left Connor in place as the manager because he knew what he was doing. This is the last clay pipe factory to close in Drogheda in 1919, and it was located over in Fair Street. Anyone again who knows the area of Drogheda, over Fair Street, and you turn left after you go by Bolton Street to go into the back of what was O'Reilly Brothers, where they used to do the glass. So it was right on that corner beside the old St. Mark's Church, Church of Ireland, Church of Ease. It was there where that clay pipe factory was that John Downey had run. Her father and mother get married in 1896 in October. Thomas Reid marries Anne Downey, Nano's mother. And at that time, Thomas Reid is running a pub in Dublin, number 13, Little Denmark Street. And he marries Anne Downey, and in August 1898, Anne Downey leaves Dublin to come down to Drogheda, to Nugent's pub, and upstairs she gives birth to Molly Reid. She goes back to Dublin then with Molly Reid, and in around about probably late February 1900, Anne Downey comes down again, and again goes into the Downey premises here in the public house in Magdalen Street, and she gives birth to Nano. So the two of them were born in Magdalen Street, in today would be Nugent's pub. And then, as I said, in June of that year, you see the license being transferred. The licence is also gone in Dublin, so her father and mother then moved with the two kids back down to Drogheda and into the premises, which would be number 19, Peter Street, number 1 Fair Street, and they move in there. In 1904, Anne Downey gives birth to their only brother, James Downey, and so he's 4 years Nano's junior. And then in 1908, the last child is born, and that's Jane, or Jenny, the youngest sister. So the youngest two, Jane, who became a nurse, and James, who moved off to the States after he got married in 1946. The two youngest kids were born in what today would be Clark's Pub. The two elder sisters, definitely born above in Nugent's Pub in Magdalen Street. So this is the first time that you see Nano's name in print in a newspaper. And it's easy to work out her names as we're moving through the 20th century, because she's born in 1900 is brilliant. Because we all know then, whether it was 1911, she's 11, or 1965, she's 65. So it's easily able to keep track on Nano's age according to where she was moving, whether it was Paris, London, Dublin, Drogheda. Easy to follow her. And this is where she gets her first name mentioned from the Siena Convent for freehand model drawn. This in 1916. They're down here now living in Clark's Pub, and in 1916 her father goes out and buys Mel House, Killinea. But John Downey dies. The grandfather who owned Mel House dies in 1909, and hence the places are starting to be sold. So Nugent's has gone pretty much in 1909, 1910. Thomas Reid and Anne Downey are back down here in the pub, which today is Clark's, and her aunt Agnes Downey moves back in after losing her husband in Gormeston, and is saying she's leaving the public house, which became Mary Clare's. I'm going at the end of the month, she writes on the census in 1911. So Downey dies in 1909, and the premises in Mel was certainly sold. So I'm not sure if this is the same place as to who he actually bought it from. But he bought the place in Mel for 2,630 quid on November the 11th, this week actually back now 106 years ago, in 1916. When you go to 1917, you see here that Nano Reid again is picking up examination results of 1917 from the Drogheda Technical School. And here's the second mention that she gets. This one here is another award from the Drogheda Agricultural Show. The Drogheda Agricultural Show is a huge event that used to be run every year on the premises that I think became the Lourdes Hospital. Was built on the same premises, the Drogheda Agricultural Show. And it was a brilliant show. Lots of people taking part in art and agricultural shows, all these kind of trade exhibitions and everything. But here her address at this one is given at Mel House. So again, not in Fair Street, but she's above in a premises that Thomas Reid, her father, had bought in 1916. Whether that's the same premises that her grandfather had, even though they say Mel House, I'm just not sure if it's the actual same premises. The next one she gets is again the Drogheda Agricultural Show 1990, and her address here. So again, she's picking up 2 awards here, Nano Reid, Killinea, and again up here, Nano Reid, Mel or Mill House, to have it here, Killinea. So that's her address again. And again here, 1920, she's picking up more than a couple of awards, and again she's given her address here as Killinea, and her age at this time then is 20 years of age. This one here is given as Fair Street in Drogheda, and this is 1921. Difficult to see there, but this show, the Drogheda Agricultural Show again, and she picked up painting in oils, and again she picked up another mechanical drawing, or original painting, number 1 Miss Nano Reid of Fair Street in Drogheda. So she's given her address here as Fair Street. So Nano, by what I've found, is out in Downey's, in Mel House, or her father's premises, which may have been her grandfather's. She's also out in Reid's, and then she's in the pub here in Drogheda. And as a youngster then, she would also have been running up and down the street between the different premises that her grandfather owned. So her father as well, Thomas Reid, became a councillor in Drogheda, a very highly and respected councillor sitting at the meetings and so on. There's plenty about him in the newspapers. And her grandfather being mayor in 1901. So mixed up in politics from the beginning, mixed up in the farming life from the beginning. So a bit of rural and urban at the same time, mixed up in urban society among a very old town. And right in between all these pubs, between Magdalen Street and Fair Street, of course, was the weekly cattle market sales. So you had lots of people coming in from the rural communities who were then drinking in these pubs. So she was probably a little bit full of it too at the same time. I could imagine like she's in sort of grocer shops, public houses, interaction with politics, interaction with farming and rural community, and in urban situation as well, but very much rural throughout the whole streets. So she was living the life of Riley, picking it always up and watching people coming in and out of premises and coming in and out to see her father as being a councillor. From the very beginning, Nana was mixed up with people coming and going. This is one from the Drogheda Independent of August the 4th, 1923. And again, it's just a little bit in it. Miss Nano Reid of Drogheda was successful at the recent scholarship examination at the Metropolitan School of Art in Dublin. So we're only here at the beginning, when she's about to leave what I would call the departure, the first 23 years. Yet she has had mention in the local press at this stage, from the age of 14 years of age. And this one here again, just as she's about to leave, so this is August, and within the following month or so, her father is buying the premises in James Street, and this is the transfer of licence. So as she's about to go to Dublin, her father is just about to leave Fair Street and move down across the river to buy the premises in James Street. Her aunt had sold the last premises in Magdalen Street, and her grandfather had since, his family had sold off the premises he owned. So just as Thomas Reid was making that transaction from this part of the town to the next, Nana was en route leaving the town. So she was like almost like homeless. It was time for her departure at that stage, so it suited her just right at this stage. 1923, she's moving, so too is her father. So they do move into James Street, and this is Thomas Reid. Her mother dies in, they moved down in 1923, and she only lasts less than a year. In May of 1924, her mother dies suddenly. Anne Downey Reid dies suddenly in the public house in James Street. So that leaves herself and her brother, James, Jenny, Molly, and Thomas Reid had all moved now, and Nana, of course, had departed. So they record the death of the old respected citizen of Drogheda, which was Thomas Reid, September the 5th. And by the end of September 1931, Mary Reid, or Molly, Mary Bridget, she's just about to get an interim licence to take over from her father after he passes away in September. And he gets a fine obituary in the local newspapers for what he had done in his life. 1933, here again is the Drogheda Argus of May 1933 and November 1933. And again, there's just little bits about the local newspapers again picking up on her. So that they're just talking about the exhibitions that she's having in Dublin. And last week it was my pleasure to refer to 6 broadcast stars that now enhance our town, and they go on to speak about Nano Reid getting recognition. So this is what I was saying about that Nano was unrecognised in our town. The local newspapers were certainly on to her at every turn that she made. Moving on to 1934, her first public exhibition, which was in Stephen's Green in Dublin. So that's the first mention she gets. And again, the Drogheda Argus. I'm using local newspapers because again, she was starting to appear now in national newspapers at the same time. This is a portrait painting that she done in 1935 of Karl Hardebeck. Hardebeck was a German, son of a German who had married a Welsh woman, and he was born in 1869. And as a child, he was blind and lived in London and became fascinated with Irish music. And he became an eminent collector of Irish music, songs and traditional music, and was a brilliant piano player. Hardabeck moves to Belfast in the early 20th century, and then he moves down to Dublin, and then he moves down to Cork and does great things when he moves down here. I'm not sure where she would have carried out this actual portrait. I wish she was pretty good at portrait painting. But Hardabeck had given a lecture in Drogheda on his musical skills and played the piano in 1932. And he had given that lecture here in, just behind the building here in the Whitworth Hall in Lawrence Street. And Nano had certainly, when she left Drogheda, went to the Metropolitan School of Art. She was in Paris, but not for long. She was in Paris for only a few months, maybe less than 6 months, in around 1929 to 1930. And when she comes back from Paris, she goes to London. And she stays in London again only for about 6 months. And Nano arrives back in Dublin. And she didn't like London one little bit. She hated London. And she spoke about it later on, that how much she detested London. So Nano had left Drogheda in 1923, had then moved on to Paris for a while, come back to London, and then back to Dublin. And so she was set, and she had a flat in Dublin then, along with a few other artist mates of hers. So I was trying to think, would Nano have coming down and seeing Hardabeck? And the reason I say that is because she did say in interviews as well that her first love was never painting anyway. Her first love was the piano, and also quickly followed by poetry, which she read from the time she was a child. She was reading the Yeats at the breakfast table with the book standing up in front of her and reading other Irish poetry as well. So her first love in life was certainly not art, from her own mouth. That's what she said. Did she come back to see Hardabeck in Drogheda, or how did she make the connection to go and do a portrait painting of him? But as you can see there, she didn't do a half bad job, and this is done in 1935 and picked up by the Irish press. 1936, this is a mention about Drogheda's new technical school, because Nano did go to the technical school at night time as well, over here in Fair Street, the old technical school, almost facing down Duke Street. And that school existed up until the summer of 1936, when they opened up the new school over here in King Street. And again, this is Drogheda Independent, October the 10th, 1936, and it's a tribute, women artist exhibits, and it's the following tribute to Miss Nano Reid, the Drogheda painter, who was this week holding an exhibition of her work at the Daniel Egan Galleries in Stephen's Green. And so they go on to do a huge article at this time again in the Drogheda Independent about Nano, a whole page full of it. And this is again another clip from the same article, that while she was over in Mayo, because again in the early 1930s, with many of the artists, she up sticks and she goes a lot to the west. She's in Donegal, Sligo, Blacksod and Achill in Mayo, and places like that. And she's doing a lot of portrait paintings. And again, a mention of here where she had discovered a family of Irishmen who bore an extraordinary resemblance to southern peoples. Not meaning people from Cork or Kerry, but meaning people from the Iberian Peninsula, which again gives you the knowledge that Nano Reid had, as you see in her paintings later on, about the knowledge she had about prehistory, mythology, archaeology, history, that type of knowledge she had, where it took many years after this time where she had thought they had a similar resemblance to southern peoples, that her DNA actually does take us back to there. So she had a great eye for seeing people. As we say, that we have a very strong link. The Irish people have a very strong link with the people of the Iberian Peninsula. And for something as early back as 1936, for her to start recognising this, gives you an idea of why maybe later on in life that she had a real deep love and sense of prehistory, and no better place to have it than maybe in the Boyne Valley area. The Drogheda Independent of October the 24th, 1936. This is about Drogheda people will be given an opportunity next week. This is when Nano decided that she's the first person to be asked to come to give a lecture, an exhibition of her paintings, a lecture of any description. And she's the first person after they opened the school. So the school was only officially opened. It was ready in April 1936. and they didn't open it until the end of the summer officially in 1936. And Nano was the first person who was asked to come back. And this is the one that she spoke about later on in interviews. Asha, nobody turned up, and she told people in her pub, Asha, only a handful turned up. Anyway, she went ahead and done that exhibition coming up to Halloween. This is the actual school here, the new technical school that opened in 1936. A brilliant piece of work. It's a protected monument structure now in Drogheda. The modernistic movement of that kind of Art Deco period, the massed concrete slabs, the straight square building, the big square metal windows, the concrete canopy over the door, and the added piece on the top. It's a fascinating piece. Some people regard it as ugly for years, but there's a good preservation on that school now. So this is the place that Nano came, just over here at the end of William Street, in King Street, where you can see this was then a new school in 36. And then there was local people interested, which is the following week after she'd given that lecture around Halloween. And it was large numbers of people from the town and surrounding countryside viewed the interesting selection of paintings by Nano. And this is repeated in a few more newspapers as well, how good this lecture was and that people had flocked into it. And there's a few more instances of this, examples of this, of how many people turned up to see this lecture in October of 1936. Going into the 1940s, the bit of the lean years, the Second World War was on the go as well. And Nano may have started to change, maybe, because she was good at portrait painting, and she mentions how good she was even at portrait painting, and that she didn't really like it because she was nearly too good. And some people had referred to her as being too good at capturing the images of people. And maybe she took an option to go abstract painting for various different reasons, including the period that's in it. Not only the Second World War, but that we're now coming into when she began and into the 30s and 40s, like photography became hugely widespread, as did colourful magazines, collection of albums, and television. So maybe they have to opt to go a different angle, to go into abstract art rather than just portrait paintings if they were all trying it. So Nano was out in the west of Ireland a lot doing these portrait paintings before she ever returned and came back to Dublin. But the likes of these King of Cats by Eileen O'Fraylon, this is an illustration she done, and she done several of these for little poetry books and children's books throughout the lean years, you'd say, of the 1940s, when art wasn't so much prominence. And this is how she probably made her bread and butter throughout the 40s. There's also instances and examples of her doing work of murals, and she'd done a lot of murals in around Dublin on one particular building, which unfortunately was subsequently knocked, but the whole side of it was done with a mural of Nano, by Nano. And the second work that she done was a lot of work in Dublin Zoo, where she done the snake and the python pens, and she done the whole back walls of those in beautiful murals throughout the 1940s. She's also selling little Christmas cards and other type of, with sketches on them, from the card shop in Dawson Street in Dublin, where a lot of artists sold their work. And this would be throughout the 1940s. But going through the 1940s, she did put on exhibitions all over the country. And when I was looking for her by name, I found her in several counties, from as far away as Kerry, Tralee, down to Cork, down to places like in Wexford, sometimes places that you think are in the back of beyond. And this was throughout the 1940s, and she's jumping around the country. She's really flying around, doing little exhibitions in small towns all over the country. Her brother gets married in July 1946, and he marries a woman called Kangley from Dundalk, and they head off shortly after this. He gets married, James Reid gets married. His address at the time of his marriage is Carntown Castle, so the ancestral home of the Reids out at Ballymakenny. They move to America, and James is going to come home from America in 1970 when he drops dead, as far as I know, in America. So he never came back. He was due home in 1970. That was after they'd sold a pub in James's Street, and James was due to return home when he drops dead, I think, of a heart attack in 1970. Again, this is coming up to the 1950s, where Drogheda by Martin O'Doreen, another little book of poetry where Nano done the illustrations for that kind of work. So there were several of these works that she done from the early 1940s right up to 1950, and indeed continued on into the 1960s with Elizabeth Hickey from the Mead Archaeological Society, where she done illustrations for her book. Again, Drogheda Argus 1950. This is them following up by saying she's bringing great credit to the town again, the biennial, international biennial in Venice, where she was hugely renowned for doing her work there with Nora McGuinness, and got massive coverage, international coverage she got at that time, not just regional or national, but international coverage. But again, I'm using the local papers again to say that at every step of the way, locals picking up the newspaper, and unlike today where we get massive information coming from all directions, very little from newspapers, that day it was only newspapers, so people would read the newspapers from front to back and maybe back to front again. So people were certainly aware of Nano Reid. Like I said, maybe not understood her, but certainly they were aware of her. In 1954, a new extension was put on to Reid's pub. So this is the place on the far right, the Dublin Gate Bar. So it was Reid's, or Thomas Reid's bar at the beginning, and in 1954 this new extension was put onto it, and it was this part of the extension. You're almost going to go down the Marsh Road now, so you're just about heading out of Drogheda town, past St Mary's Church and going up the Dublin Road, and there was a big drop down into the Marsh Road where the lorries used to come right up by and shake those buildings. As Betty Quinn had told me, Betty and Matt had lived in it after Nano and them had vacated the premises, and the lorries would be coming up from the factories and they would literally be shaking the ground so much that the buildings would shake. So this extension was put on in 1954, and it was opened by P.J. Burke, who was the father of we call him infamous, Ray Burke was his son, and that's who had opened the pub officially for the Reids in 1954. And it said, and on the walls adorned, at least two of Nano's paintings adorned the wall of the latest premises that they'd opened in 1954. Again, this is another one from the Drogheda Argus, and it's under the spotlight. And this is again a huge article. It's a whole page, if not a double one. And as you know, that day, the further back in time you go, the newspaper columns are literally full of thousands of words in them. But she gives a great interview in this particular paper, and she's under the spotlight again. Local newspaper on her tail the whole way through her career. 1959, again, this one, an exhibition of paintings by Nano Reid, James Street, Drogheda, the well-known Irish artist. Opened on Tuesday at the Dawson Gallery in Dublin, 1959. Again, the Drogheda Argus. The Drogheda Independent of 1960. And this was the Mead Archaeological Society who had come on a visit to Drogheda, and they had gone to Miss Reid, kindly allowed them to see her painting of the Buttergate with Millmount in the background. Again, 1960. She's fighting with the Drogheda Corporation from around 1958, 59 for sure. They're starting to think that the Buttergate, part of a medieval gate which is down near the bus depot now in Drogheda, you can just see the remnants of it near the bus depot. And there's a brilliant image in the Millmount Museum archives of corporation men standing on top of the Buttergate with sledgehammers after the day they began to knock it from the top down. And Nano, of course, was saying that these monuments belong to the people of the town and that they'd no right to knock them, and that wouldn't it be better off collecting a few quid and getting them to be preserved rather than knocking them. By the looks of things as well, when she was giving out about things, she hated change. She liked to see things that was almost set in stone as she'd see it, and she went nuts over this being knocked, and she made several letters of complaints to the Drogheda Independent editor, and was going in banging the counter every other week about the preservation of the Buttergate. Also throughout the 1940s, you had this new group of artists who came about, this new younger group of artists who became really friendly with Nano, many of them from the north of the country. George Campbell was one, Dan O'Neill, Gerard Dillon. They were all brilliant artists in their own right, but they arrived down in Dublin in the 40s, and they, along with Nano, they really become a tight-knit unit, particularly Gerard Dillon. He was 16 years her junior, born in 1916, in West Belfast. He was a painter by trade, as in an ordinary household painter at the beginning. He was gay as well, and he was in London, I think, at the start of the Second World War when he up sticks and skipped it in case of conscription or whatever, arrived back in Belfast and comes down to Dublin. And he became really a firm friend of Nano's. He a brilliant painter in his own right, an artist. And it was Dylan who christened her Buttergate Reid, is the nickname he put on her for the fighting she was doing over to save the Buttergate. Again, she was against archaeology, which she had said about ripping open monuments. You're better off imagining what's in them rather than to rip them open and destroy them, as all excavation is probably destruction in some way. She was totally against opening up these burial mounds along the river. So she had all this in her head, and Dylan used to be down around Drogheda, and the two of them done a series of paintings, right from Dunaney Point along the coast, right out to Mornington, and right over to the west of Ireland, but particularly up along the Boyne Valley. So Reid was really a great friend of hers, and even when Reid came, or not Reid, Dylan, when Dylan came even to stay with her in James Street, every time Dylan would turn up in town, the Drogheda Independent were on to him, and they knew about Dylan. And Nano Reid's friend, the great artist Dylan, is in town. So she was definitely well known in Drogheda. Maybe people shrugged their shoulders and said, for what? Maybe, I have no idea, but they certainly knew who Nano Reid was if they were reading the paper. She returns in 1962. In 1964 or 5, she gives a brilliant interview, probably one of the biggest and best she gave. I'm trying to think of what, I haven't got it here, I don't think. She gave it to Marion Fitzgerald from the Western People, and it's a huge article, and it's all about her whole life. And she said she was sick of Dublin. I think she gives that interview, it might be 65, I think she came back in 63, and she refers to her coming back that Dublin's getting too noisy, getting too overcrowded, getting too expensive, is what she said as well, because she wasn't making a whole load of money. At sometimes she refers to herself being nearly on the verge of starving, and hence doing these works like the murals and so on in Dublin, because they weren't making a whole load of money, and she couldn't survive anymore. So she was coming back down to now live in James Street with her sister Molly, and she was well able then, she said, to walk up the Dublin Road and take the train back into Dublin, and that she really liked Drogheda and she had missed it. So she returns in the early 1960s, and the next time I find out anything about her is by talking to an ex-barman who's still alive. He used to work below in Reid's, a fella called Philip Malone. And Philip is still alive, and he and Charlie Campbell's still very much alive, worked in the cellar in the pub and done bits and pieces around the place and cleaned the windows and so on for them. And they had spoken a lot about Nano when she came back, and they told me that Charlie Campbell had told me that Nano used to bring him and Philip Malone and ask the two of them to leave the pub in James Street and come to this premises. It's almost outside the door. As soon as you go outside the door and walk down William Street, it's on your left hand side, facing almost just beyond the entrance into the Lawrence's Town Centre. So this place here is on William Street outside the door. It's a double house that was built in around 1875, so Victorian house. Next door to it is where the books we have on the table this evening, which is T.K. Whitaker would have lived in the early 1920s, next door to this premises. And they shared the carriage arch, beautiful door, original door with the fretwork. Many original features are still on this house. But they told me that it was here, upstairs in these windows, that Nano had her studio. And I thought she rented it when she came back and lived with Molly. I said, geez, maybe she hadn't got a studio in the pub. But they said, no, she used to do painting in the pub as well, but more sketches in the pub. But she had a studio here. So when I went and delved into this and said, I wonder who she was renting this place off, it turned out that she didn't have rented this place off anyone. That the further back you go, who do you find owns it? Only her father. And her father actually owned it in 1911. So while they're over here in the pub, beside us here in Clark's pub, he actually owned this at the same time. So Reid had owned this premises from an early age. And then Charlie Campbell was brought down at one stage, and Philip Malone, and they were given boxes And the boxes would be sketches that Nano had done, illustrations for later paintings, and they would be told to dump them. So that's what they done. They would go down and literally get the boxes and go out and dump them. And Philip Malone was getting married, and she'd asked him down one day, and she brought him in upstairs, and on the back wall was a row of paintings on the floor, standing against the wall, and she said to Malone to choose one for his wedding present. And he had said later on, I don't think he'd said it to Nano, but he definitely said it later on when he went home to the family, and his sister was able to confirm it to me, Margaret, was saying, what the hell would I be doing buying a painting with a cat with two heads or whatever it was. He didn't want one. And his sister didn't say any more to me, but Declan Mallon, who wrote the book on Nano Reid, which is a brilliant foundation level at the beginning of Nano, published in 1994, and Declan Mallon told me that, in fact, whatever Philip Malone did say to her, he didn't take a big painting off her, which was on offer to him, but he did take a very small one. And it's almost like the one she done of the Lilter. It's of a portrait painting of some description, very tiny one, and the Philip Malone still has it, and it's a little treasure. So it's here where she was doing some of her painting, at least, when she came back down in the 1960s. This is an interesting one. This is a painting that she had done. She had done several then. The first one she done of the Boyne Valley that I can find is 1939, and she does Boyne at Rossnaree is the name of the painting she does. And these are the abstract ones. These are the ones that I know very little about, and you could stare at them from now to Christmas, and somebody does have to point out what art historians, what they can see in them, the dark and the light and the shadows and all the rest of it that she's doing. But she'd done her first one in 1939, Boyne at Rossnaree. She done Nakba or Nakwi, which is Louth, and Bowen, the goddess Bowen. She done the tomb of Bowen, the tomb of Louth in 1956. And this one, which I think is one of the brilliantest names ever given to a painting, where Angus Oak magnificently dwells. And this is Newgrange that she's done, where Angus Oak magnificently dwells. Just as Professor O'Kelly was about to excavate Newgrange in 1962. So as O'Kelly came out, she was against archaeology and opening up mounds. And as he was taking his trowel to the mound, she was taking a brush to her palette to do the painting of it. So what Nano Reid done, this first went on show in Belfast in 1963. And just as he was about to attack the mound from the very beginning, the first excavation, Nano had gone down and painted the mound. So she's done a painting of this. There's a hell of a lot of stuff in Nano Reid too, which is very much copyrighted, and that's why I have a couple of images of the paintings which I was able to get around. I'll show you in a couple of minutes, but an awful lot of her stuff is heavily copyrighted, where Angus Oak magnificently dwells, and I don't even think it was in the exhibition last year here. So a lot of them are in private ownership, albeit there was 60-something paintings on show. But she's done a painting of this Newgrange. Just as O'Kelly was about to excavate it, you have to realise that O'Kelly had not known anything about Newgrange. This was summer work they were doing at the beginning. He hadn't even found the window box until 1964 or 65 to allow the sun shine into the tomb. So all that was completely unknown at the time, apart from the locals who used to tell O'Kelly when he came in the beginning, the sun lights up that cave. And he said he didn't know what they were talking about. He didn't know what they were talking about even when he found the window box. It was only after that he seen the sun one winter's morning, and he thought, Jesus. And he said he thought back to what the locals told him in 1962. So they had no clue about the window box or anything. And the story about Angus Oak, like where his mother Bowen had said, which is in the 11th or 12th century manuscript, young as the sun who was begotten at the break of day and born betwixt it and the evening. That's in the manuscript. That's about Angus Oak and the sun being stopped by the Dag the Mower, who has an affair with Bowen and creates the love child Angus Oak, and he is Angus of the Brew. And there's the history of the Boyne Valley of Newgrange. Angus of the Brew is Angus of the Palace. The movements of the sun being stopped, and all of a sudden it's later on that this window box. So she's captured an image of a painting that now is something, it's a World Heritage Site that very few people knew little about when this went on show in the beginning. So as she took a brush against O'Kelly, he was taking a trowel, to reveal what was inside the mound. So the two of them work hand in hand, and I think it's a brilliant image, brilliant, not only an image, but a brilliant title that she actually gave that painting. This is the front cover of Elizabeth Hickey's book, I Send My Love Along the Vine. And again, Nano was invited to a dinner when Elizabeth Hickey, who was a member of the Mead Archaeological Society, and Elizabeth was thinking of doing this book back in the 60s, 64 or 5, and she'd asked a certain amount of people to come to dinner at her home, and one of them was Nano, and she told Nano to bring along her portfolio of illustrations. And Nano brings along her portfolio of illustrations, and again, we end up in the book I Send My Love Along the Vine, and they're absolutely brilliant images. And that's one of them from within inside the book, and again, that's the entrance to Newgrange. That's looking into the passage across the entrance door into the actual passageway of Newgrange that appears in the book. So there's loads of these little sketches, brilliantly done by Nano for Elizabeth Hickey in 1966. This is just some of the list, just showing you the variations that Nano done. So on the left here, when we have those kind of titles that you put, the makeshift gate at Wild Goose Lodge, when I seen that a couple of years ago, at the time Aoife was just about to start, coming up to the 40th anniversary of Nano's death, so coming into 2021 last year, I seen an image of it then, and Aoife gave me a copy of an image which I'd sent to Kieran Campbell, and I'd asked Kieran what did he think of it, and was there anything left of Wild Goose Lodge. So Kieran was explaining to me about where exactly it was and what it looked like, and that where it was on the knoll of a hill, you can see what of course would have been disturbance in nettles and thistles and humps and bumps in the field, and a weird looking place, he said, when you go down to it. But Kieran also said that because to me, as I said, I just don't understand it, some of Nano's artwork, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, but it just looks sometimes as if you threw painting on a wall and then another bucket and the whole thing just splashes. It's an art historian who can tell you that that's not quite right and what's in it. But the painting of the makeshift gate of Wild Goose Lodge does show, it's almost like a hanging cage, as exactly where them men were put in 1817 or whenever it was when they killed those 9 people, and they were rounded up because in 1818, or after that, a year after that, was there was a travel writer, forget his name, William something or other, Carleton, and Carleton was walking around County Louth looking for a blind piper called Gaynor, who he was told was hanging around Louth village, and while Carleton was looking for is the peasantry, the tracks and trace of peasantry or something, and it's when Carleton was looking for him, he come across Gaynor, but he also come across these lads still in the cage, dead after being executed by the authorities the year before. And again, it's interesting, she picks up on that. It looks like the cage and it looks like fire coming up, as if she's reflecting back to what happened at Wild Goose Lodge. Cave of the Fair Bulg, one of the last ones she done that while she moved up to Sunnyside Villas after they sold the pub. That was done in 1973. Boyne of Roscommon in 1939. Ancient Cave, Bowen, now that old town on the river. Buttergate Reid, which was Dylan referring to tour on the Buttergate. On the other side then, view from the artist's window, the Botlin Cellar Workman hanging out the washing. All of those ones, Quayside Strollers, Tar in the Shed, they all seem to have been done from James's Street. She had a studio at the back of the premises, so it looked out onto James's Street, but the back window looked over the South Quay, over the river. A brilliant view she had. One side she had the viaduct, the other side she's St Mary's Bridge, built in 1864. Beautiful design bridge, which she done many sketches of, and Dylan done a number of them. And these are the views that she could certainly see from James's Street, and hanging out the washing. And there's other ones, the cat on the barrel, and then down with the countryside, cattle on the hillside, fire in the open. Tinkers gathering firewood. She done a lot of stuff on Tinkers, Travellers Camp, Tinkers Camp, this kind of thing. And again, she seemed to, a lot of the times the Tinkers would be down the Marsh Road. So in the 1960s, when the Tinkers would come around on a yearly basis, stay above in Dominic's Park or down along the Marsh Road, down towards Ship Street. And she seemed to have visited the Tinkers a lot, done a lot of painting on the Tinkers, and probably understood maybe where their origins lay as well. When you get into the depths of Nano, the southern peoples, where the DNA comes from, that she was able to see that in Mayo in the 30s. And it also comes from the travelling community as well, which have a deeper connection to the Iberian Peninsula than we have for sure. And that's well been proven in recent years. So these are the kind of paintings that she was doing from one extreme, maybe the prehistoric and the mythology, archaeology, into the rural and into the kind of urban setting that was Drogheda. Many of these as well, cattle on a hillside, cattle in a thicket. Many of them are out around the Carntown area as well on the land, or up around Mel House that she was doing in relation to that. This is an interesting one, which again, the reason I'm showing is because it's in Declan Mallon's book, and I've seen Declan, and Declan's given me permission to be able to show what's in his book. So that's how I got some of these up. Tommy Wallace. This was done in the early 1930s. It's about 1931 when she was down the west of Ireland. And John McCullen, who's here with us this evening, and John had spoken to me last year as well. We were trying to get a photograph, and John was trying to find this photograph for me of a young Nano who went to school with John's people, and we had a telephone conversation, and one thing leads into another. But John told me about the story behind this little lad. He was, I think, in Blackshot in Mayo when she painted him, Tommy Wallace, and Declan Mallon also has a variation of the same story in his book, and it's about this painting. I think, if I get it right, I know John will correct me if it's not right, but it was bought by a woman called Eileen McCullen. It hung, she was a friend of Nano's, and she had bought the painting off her, and it hung in Dr. McCullen's surgery over here in Fair Street, and I think it went down to his son. From Declan, I think it said it went down to his son, but the Dr. McCullen had suggested that it was a perfect image of a young lad who was having breathing or asthmatic difficulties, hence the big red nose on him, and that he had got no handkerchief to wipe his nose, and that Nano, according to Dr. McCullen, had captured a brilliant image of an asthmatic young lad with breathing difficulties. Nano visited the doctor's son, Jim McCullen, I think his name may have been, many years later, and had seen that painting, and he had been told back to her that according to the doctor, it was a brilliant image of a young lad suffering from asthmatic problems or breathing difficulties. And she said nothing of the sort. She said that's not what was in her head. What was in her head was the hunger and desperation and desolate future prospects of that young lad that she had captured in Mayo. That was her idea. And I'm walking out of the surgery, she turned around and said, "Do you know something? I never realised I could paint as good as that." And she walked out. She didn't do portrait paintings in her later life. All the portrait paintings, at least I think they are all early. And she was pretty good at them, as you can see here, and from other images. Again, from 1932 down the west, and it's a Galway peasant. Again, a brilliant capture of an image of a portrait painting. And again, come from Declan Mallon's book. And this may be some of her abstract work, Backyard. So again, taken from James's Street, looking out as she would with Jerry Cullen, looking out to the sea, whatever she was thinking about, looking out her window and what she could see from James's Street. And again, the images, the cat up here in the corner. And as Betty Quinn had said to me, and Matt, when they lived in the house after the Reids had vacated the place in 1968, Nano would often return, and most of the time she'd return would be to see that our cats and kittens were getting on all right. Because anyone that knows, if you live and move and you have cats, they usually, if they're within any distance, sometimes within weeks, they'll go back to where they came from. So the cats would always stay around the pub and didn't move off up the sunny side with Nano and her sisters when they moved. When she would call in to see that everything was okay, when she'd be on her way down from Sunnyside down by the pub, so you can see the cat sitting at the back, the likes of the barrels, still, some of them lying down an upstand in the backyard, so they look like beer barrels. And then in the background, which I just didn't capture it up in the corner. It was actually the viaduct with a steam train going across. So some of these images that you see, that Declan Mallon had said to me, that she almost flicks into some of these images at this kind of painting. This is Louth, again, which this is the Bridge of St. Mary's. And again, if she's looking out her back window, she's looking across the River Boyne and a perfect view one side of the viaduct, a perfect view upriver of the brilliant bridge that was demolished in 1984, but had stood for since 1864. And this is an image of two, literally what they are, loafers, just shuffling around the place. And this place used to be limestone. As you turn into the North Quay in Drogheda, they were limestone blocks. They're not since, they're gone now, with just railings maybe along the way. But they were so much sat on, like the Tolson, as Ted Green captured in his book. Men had sat on them and kids for so many years that they were shiny, polished shiny, and almost with a dip in them where people had sat. They didn't necessarily sit there because they were wastrels or loafers, but a lot of them used to sit there and get walked down further down the docks. And they'd gather there to get picked up on men coming up looking. But these are just two men who's just lazing round the river, and she's titled it Loafers. And again, she's just depicted them in and maybe give a heavier vision to the bridge rather than the people. This is a group of tinkers. And again, she just does, well, I'll dot them in and a little squiggle here and there. A lot of her paintings are like this. Cattle in a thicket, cattle on a hillside. And it's almost as if in some parts of the landscape, and again, I'm nowhere near an art historian or anything like it, but it's almost as if she flashes them in as if they're on the landscape but not part of it. Maybe that was in her head, that it's the landscape she's looking at. She didn't like change. She done the Buttergate, Monster Boys, Elephant Abbey, Lawrence's Gate. So she done the medieval, the rural, the urban, the monuments along the Boyne Valley, the illustrations of the tombs and everything. But when she does people or animals on the landscape, it's almost the way she does them is a flick. And it's almost as if they're going through the landscape rather than being part of the landscape or part of the streetscape. Another one she does of two people strolling down the North Quay, it's called Strollers, or Strollers by the river or something. And they're almost like ghostly figures. They're barely moving through the landscape where everything else around them can be made out, but the figures can't be. So it's almost as if maybe she was thinking, these people are not part of the landscape, they're on it, but they're not actually part of what I'm painting. They're not of the landscape, they're passing through it. Maybe that was her way of thinking of some of these kind of images. This is a painting which she thought brilliant of. She sold it in 1962 to two sisters called Gaynor. They brought it to America, and then of the great show of New York in 1966, or one of them years shortly after, she thought so much of that painting that there was an exhibition in New York called 12 Irish Painters, and Nano was one of them. And she actually thought that much of it that she went to those sisters and borrowed it back just to show at this particular exhibition in New York. And it's just called Ratplan Moor. It's a souterrain. That's a photograph of it there. I've no image of the painting itself, and even when I did see it, I didn't understand it. It's a black hole with light around it as well, but she's trying to depict, according to art historians, that she's trying to depict what lies beneath. In other words, the other world, it's beneath the ground. And this is out at, it's not far from Belpatrick or Smarmore. It's almost on the boundaries between Meath and Dublin as you're going between Cullen and Slane. It's almost on the boundaries, but it's in County Louth. And that souterrain today is still accessible, I think. It's on the north side of the road, and it's about 11 metres in length. It's in an inverted L shape, I think, and ended in a beehive-shaped chamber. And again, the 1937 school folklore books are full of folklore about this particular underworld, like a parallel world to our own, and where the fairies or the Tuatha Dé Danann may have deposited and went underground. So again, it's a brilliant view of Nano, of getting herself out on the landscape and going to extraordinary places, something that means really nothing to no one. That actually does appear on the 1836 first edition maps. Very difficult to read, but it does say cave, and it's again there in 1909, or the next edition of the map. And you'd wonder, where did she hear about this? What brings her out there? And what lies deeper in Nano's thoughts like when she said Southern peoples, and she does the paintings of them, the Boyne Valley, Angus Oak, Ratbrand Moor. She reading the likes of Yeats. She'd a wealth of knowledge by the looks of things, and this is without computers or we are people that I talk to that's even younger than me today think, so what? Because they just think everything is there for them. Touch of a button, 3 o'clock in the morning, you can get up and do fucking research. But you couldn't do it like 20 years ago, and you certainly couldn't do it when she was about. I remember going to Dublin, you'd be halfway home on the train reading your stuff, and you wish you could get off the damn train and go back again with your pencil and write more. Now you can touch a button and have it right in front of your sitting room. So to get around for a woman that wasn't even driving herself and know about these places is extraordinary in the least, never mind to go and paint them. The place was sold in 1968, Reid's Pub in James Street, and the three sisters are going to head off then. They're going to live on the Mead side up near Calvary Cemetery, and it's a place called, it was number 2. There's only a road, there's 7 or 8 houses on the way down to Calvary Cemetery off the Dublin Road, and it's called Sunnyside Villas, and it's where Nano and her sisters retired to after they sold the pub in 1968. And it's there, not the one that's for sale. The next one is number 2, and it's right opposite. So they moved up there after 1968, and one of her last paintings that she done was Cave of the Fair Bulg, which is she done that in 1973, and it was then shown. Right opposite here is Chute's farm. As soon as she comes out the front door, and in behind that wall of Chute's house above, in the front garden, which is a kind of a pony paddock, is the remains of a Bronze Age ring barrow, which would be which would be dating to 4,500 years ago. They also, as soon as they moved up, it's funny, the name on the house was Errigal, which is now there's no one else could have named that, only Nano, because Errigal is the place when the Fair Bulg, the mythological race of people who came to Ireland and were here before the Tuatha Danann, but they supposedly had been depositing bags of earth in Greece up the mountains, where the mountains the water had washed away the soil, and the Fair Bulg, supposedly the bagmen, Fair Bulg, they were emptying out the bags of soil to fertilize the land, and they escaped, it was said, and of course they arrive in Ireland, and like Mount Olympus in Greece, they started worshipping the next mountain in Ireland, which was Errigal, which is part of the Seven Sisters in Donegal, and on the sinking sun in the west has got a huge pinkish hue, pinkish glow of the quartzite that's on that mountain. It's the highest mountain in the Donegal range, and it's supposedly where the Fair Bulg had worshipped after they left Greece, and so they found this place in Ireland above in Donegal, and they worshipped Errigal. It's interesting again. Did Nano know about this burial mound? It's called Cromwell's Mound, and it was only really in 1986, after her death, that it was confirmed by Victor Buckley and David Sweetman when they done the County Louth Archaeological infantry book, that they confirmed that this is almost certainly, and there's been tons of them found during the course of building in the last 20 years around the area of Bryanstown and Rathmullen. There's a lot more Bronze Age in the Boyne Valley than there is Neolithic, and around the Drogheda area, any hillside seems to have these kind of Bronze Age ring barrows. This one in Chute's Field is about, today it looks, it's only about 3.5 metres high, 40 metres in diameter, and still the traces of a little sunken ditch around it. It is where Oliver Cromwell camped in 1649 before he decided to move his guns forward, before he bombed the walls of Drogheda to get in. But always known as Cromwell's Mount, where Cromwell had camped. And you'd often wonder, did Nano go out and did she know about this? Did she see it? Was she friends with the family of Chute? And did she go in to see, and did she know that this was a little burial mound? Like, she'd done so many paintings of them in the Boyne Valley, not just the major tombs, but the unexplored burial mounds, some of them still not open today. And she'd done sketches of them and called ancient caves or caves of the warriors. So did she know as soon as she seen this? And it's that way she called the place Errigal as well, with the Fair Bulg, and do one of her last paintings in relation to them. Because it's interesting, because the technology only in the recent past has shown that something like that did happen around 2200 BC out in Malta, not Greece, where they found there was bagmen and they were fertilising the soil, and some catastrophe happened in 2200 around about the same time as that beaker movement of people across Europe. That new tradition of bronze was moving all across, and they were connected from Malta to the people in Orkney for sure. So some kind of bagmen were out there. We just might have gotten it confused with the mythological tales that we hear. But it's real interesting as to the knowledge that was in Nano's head to get that. So she passes away on November the 27th, or no, November the 17th, 1981. And again, she gets terrific right up in the local and, of course, the national and the international press when she passes away. This is her burial above in St. Peter's Cemetery on the north side here in Drogheda, up at the Louth Church. It's just a large Celtic cross, and it just records her mother and her father, her sister Jane or Jenny, and her sister who died before her, Molly. She lost a bit of life in herself. Molly died in 1978, on the 10th of November in 1978, her eldest sister, and she was after falling a year before in the bull ring, and she never went out after that, Molly. And that hit Nano a bit, because she did say it in one of her last interviews. And Nano went into herself a little bit after her elder sister died, and she passed away on the 17th of November in 1981. And it's interesting because this is from the Archaeology Ireland of 1987. It's an article by the brilliant Kieran Campbell, who's meticulous in what he does at his archaeology. Leaves nothing to chance, and everything is forensically done with Kieran. Kieran done a brilliant article in this one, and it was about the archaeology of medieval Drogheda. And Kieran speaks about the destruction of the dual carriageway going through, and it was never excavated because the laws weren't in place. But Kieran done excavations with David Sweetman around the end of Shop Street, the early 80s, and then between 1981 and 85, the new dual carriageway of James's Street, and Kieran undertook it. And right where it says Town Wall at the end, where it shows the image of the Town Wall, where it says next to it Lime Kiln, that's exactly where the Reid house stood. So just as Nano was departing, and she said it again in one of her interviews, that they left the pub, and according to her, she was happy to get out of the pub because the bulldozers are now approaching the house from the front and the back. And she hated change, she hated destruction. And she always lamented upon that, and she talks about the bulldozers are now coming from the front and the back, which they did. And then Kieran then immediately starts to excavate, but just after 1981, so just as Nano was departing from life, Kieran is digging up where the town wall actually ran through the premises of where the Reids had lived, the medieval town wall, which was a substantial height when Kieran found it, and also found the lime kiln, which Kieran had tied into, was used for building the actual medieval town walls in the early 13th century here in Drogheda. So this was the end of Nano leaving Drogheda and Kieran moving in to find more archaeology underneath where Nano lived. I'm sure if she had to live for another 2 or 3 years, she would have having good conversations with Kieran Campbell, and I'd say the two of them would have probably got on having that conversation as well. So that's the end of it. That was it. Nano Reid, the life and times of her from 1900 to 1981. We could stand here for the next 10 years and probably talk more about her, but maybe some of you have something to add or questions about it. But thank you very much. Thank you.